The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cramped changing room at Fort Jackson, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. Sarah Martinez sat on the wooden bench, methodically lacing up her combat boots, her movements precise and controlled. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of military service, though most people who saw her now would never guess her background. The transfer to this new base had been routine paperwork, another step in her transition to a different role within the military structure. After 20 years as a Navy SEAL, Sarah had decided to move into training and advisory positions. Her record spoke for itself: multiple deployments, countless successful operations, and the respect of every commander she had served under. But here, in this new environment, she was just another face in the crowd. The changing room door slammed open, startling the few other women who were quietly preparing for their shifts. 3 male soldiers strutted in, their voices loud and boisterous, clearly thinking they owned the space. Sarah glanced up briefly, noting their ranks and the swagger in their step. Corporals, maybe sergeants at best, young, cocky, and apparently unaware they had just entered the women's changing area. "Excuse me?" said Lieutenant Rebecca Chen, a petite intelligence officer who had been changing quietly in the corner. "This is the women's changing room. You need to leave." The largest of the 3 soldiers, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped hair, laughed roughly. His name tag read Harrison. He looked around the room with mock surprise, his eyes settling on Sarah with particular interest. "Oh, really?" Harrison sneered. "Looks like just another room to me. Maybe you ladies should find somewhere else to change if you don't like the company." Sarah continued lacing her boots, her expression neutral. She had encountered this type before, soldiers who thought their presence automatically commanded respect, regardless of their actual rank or experience. In her 20 years of service, she had learned to pick her battles carefully. The second soldier, shorter but equally aggressive, moved closer to Lieutenant Chen. His name tag showed Rodriguez. "Yeah, we were here first anyway. Military property belongs to all of us, doesn't it?" Rebecca's face flushed red, but she stood her ground. "You know perfectly well this space is designated for women. There are protocols and regulations about this." The third soldier, Jackson, according to his uniform, circled around behind Rebecca while she was speaking. Sarah's trained eyes caught the movement immediately, recognizing the tactical positioning. These weren't just bullies being inappropriate, they were coordinating their intimidation. "Protocols?" Harrison laughed again, this time with a darker edge. "What protocols? I don't see any signs saying we can't be here. Do you see any signs, Rodriguez?" "Nope, no signs," Rodriguez replied, stepping even closer to Rebecca. "In fact, I think these ladies might be the ones in the wrong place." Sarah finished with her boots and stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. At 5'8", she wasn't particularly tall, but something in her posture made the room feel different. The other women in the changing area had gone completely silent, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Jackson moved behind Rebecca until he was close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. "Maybe we should help you understand where you belong," he whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. That's when Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is indeed the women's changing facility. The men's facility is down the hall, 3rd door on the right." Harrison turned his attention fully to Sarah, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "Oh, we got ourselves a spokesperson now. What are you, some kind of officer? I don't see any rank on that uniform." "I'm not wearing my dress uniform at the moment," Sarah replied evenly. "But regardless of rank, the facility designation remains the same." Rodriguez snorted with laughter. "Hear that, boys? She thinks she outranks us. What do you think we should do about that?" The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah could see that Jackson had positioned himself to grab Rebecca from behind if things went further. The other women in the room were pressed against their lockers, clearly afraid, but unsure what to do. Harrison stepped directly in front of Sarah, close enough that she could smell the cigarettes on his breath. "You know what, lady? I think you need to learn some respect. Maybe we should teach you and your friends here about how things really work in the military." "That won't be necessary," Sarah said quietly, but there was something in her tone that made Harrison pause for just a moment. "Oh, it's very necessary," Jackson said from behind Rebecca. Suddenly his arms snaked around her throat in a chokehold. "In fact, I think we should start with this one. Show her what happens when people don't know their place." Rebecca gasped, her hands clawing at Jackson's arm as he tightened his grip. The other women in the room cried out in alarm, but none of them moved to intervene. They were clerks, intelligence analysts, logistics coordinators, not combat personnel. Harrison grinned at Sarah. "What are you going to do now, spokesperson? Call for help? Security's way down the hall. By the time anyone gets here, we'll be long gone, and it'll be your word against ours." Rodriguez moved to flank Sarah from the right side. Besides, who's going to believe a bunch of women over 3 decorated soldiers? We've got combat records. Commendations! What do you have? Sarah's expression remained perfectly calm, even as she watched Rebecca struggle against Jackson's chokehold. Her breathing was controlled, her stance relaxed but balanced. 20 years of training in the world's most elite military unit had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was patience. "Let her go," Sarah said simply. "Or what?" Harrison challenged, stepping even closer. "You going to make us? You and what army?" Jackson tightened his grip on Rebecca, whose face was starting to turn red. "Come on, boss," he called to Harrison. "Let's finish this quick. I'm getting tired of holding on to this one." That's when Harrison made his mistake. He reached out to grab Sarah by the throat, intending to demonstrate their dominance over the women in the room. His hand was large and calloused, and he was confident in his ability to intimidate through physical force. Sarah moved so quickly that none of the 3 soldiers saw it coming. Her hand shot up and caught Harrison's wrist before his fingers could reach her throat. Her grip was like steel, and suddenly Harrison found himself unable to move his arm in any direction. "I said let her go," Sarah repeated, her voice still calm, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Harrison tried to pull his hand away, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. "What the hell?" Sarah applied just enough pressure to Harrison's wrist that he gasped in pain. "Your friend is cutting off oxygen to Lieutenant Chen's brain. Brain cells start dying after about 3 to 4 minutes without oxygen. We're probably at about 90 seconds right now." "Let go of me," Harrison demanded, but his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. Sarah's grip was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Rodriguez started to move toward Sarah from the side, but she shifted her position slightly, and suddenly he found himself looking at someone who seemed completely different from the woman who had been quietly lacing her boots just minutes before. "I wouldn't," Sarah advised Rodriguez without even looking directly at him. "Your friend Jackson needs to release Lieutenant Chen right now, or this situation is going to become much more complicated." Jackson, still holding Rebecca in a chokehold, looked uncertainly between Sarah and Harrison. Harrison was clearly in pain, sweat beading on his forehead, as Sarah maintained her grip on his wrist. "Let her go, Jackson!" Harrison finally managed to say through gritted teeth. "But boss!" Jackson started to protest. "Let her go now!" Harrison shouted, pain making his voice crack. Jackson reluctantly released his hold on Rebecca, who immediately collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The other women in the room rushed to her side, helping her to one of the benches. Sarah released Harrison's wrist, and he stumbled backward, cradling his hand against his chest. His face was pale, and he stared at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and growing wariness. "Now," Sarah said, straightening to her full height, "I believe I mentioned that the men's changing facility is down the hall." Rodriguez helped Harrison steady himself, both of them staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. Jackson backed away from Rebecca and the other women, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "This isn't over," Harrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Actually, it is. But if you'd like to discuss it further, I suggest you speak with your commanding officer about proper facility usage and appropriate conduct around fellow service members." The three soldiers began backing toward the door, their earlier swagger replaced by uncertainty and something that might have been fear. As they reached the exit, Harrison turned back one more time. "Who are you?" he asked. Sarah was already turning back to help Lieutenant Chen, who was still recovering from the chokehold. "Just someone who believes in following regulations," she replied without looking back. As the door closed behind the three soldiers, the changing room erupted in whispered conversations. The other women were helping Rebecca to her feet, making sure she was breathing normally and didn't need medical attention. Sarah knelt beside her, checking her pulse and looking into her eyes for signs of trauma. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, her voice hoarse from the choking. "Don't mention it," Sarah replied. "Are you feeling dizzy? Any numbness in your arms or legs?" "No, I think I'm okay. Just shaken up." Rebecca looked at Sarah with obvious curiosity. "That was incredible. How did you do that? Harrison's twice your size." Sarah stood up, offering Rebecca a hand to help her to her feet. Size isn't everything in a confrontation. Training and experience matter more. One of the other women, a young private named Davis, spoke up from across the room. "I've never seen anything like that. You move so fast, and the way you controlled that guy. Are you special forces or something?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Something like that. The important thing is that everyone's safe." But even as she said it, Sarah knew this wasn't really over. Harrison's parting words echoed in her mind. Men like that didn't like to lose face, especially not in front of their friends, and especially not to a woman. They would be back, and next time they would be prepared for resistance. As the other women gradually returned to their routines, Sarah remained alert. Her 20 years of experience had taught her to recognize when an enemy was retreating to regroup rather than truly defeated. Tonight's confrontation had been just the opening move in what was likely to become a much larger conflict. She finished gathering her gear, her mind already working through the tactical considerations. The base layout, the security protocols, the chain of command, all of it would matter in the coming days. Sarah had hoped her transition to a training role would be peaceful, but it seemed that some battles followed you no matter where you went. The changing room gradually emptied as the women finished their preparations and headed to their various assignments. Rebecca was the last to leave besides Sarah, and she paused at the door. "I don't know who you are or what your background is," she said quietly, "but I'm grateful you were here tonight. Those guys, I don't think they were planning to stop with just intimidation." Sarah nodded grimly. "Neither do I. Be careful, Lieutenant. Stay with groups when possible, and if you see those three again, don't engage. Report it to your commanding officer immediately." "What about you? Are you going to report this?" Sarah considered the question. In a perfect world, she would file a report and let the proper channels handle the discipline. But she had learned long ago that the world was far from perfect, and sometimes proper channels moved too slowly to prevent real harm. "I'll handle it," she said simply. Rebecca seemed to understand that this wasn't really an answer, but she nodded anyway. "Thank you again. I hope I see you around the base under better circumstances." After Rebecca left, Sarah remained in the changing room for a few more minutes, thinking through everything that had just happened. The three soldiers had been coordinated in their intimidation tactics, suggesting they had done this before. They knew exactly when and where to find women alone and vulnerable. This wasn't a random act of harassment, it was a pattern of behavior. Sarah finished gathering her things and headed toward the door, but stopped when she noticed something on the floor near where Harrison had been standing. A small piece of paper had fallen from his pocket during their confrontation. She picked it up and unfolded it, revealing what appeared to be a duty roster with several names circled in red. All of the circled names were women. Sarah folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. This confirmed her suspicions. Harrison and his friends weren't random bullies. They were predators with a system, and tonight's confrontation had probably saved more than just Rebecca from whatever they had planned. As she walked through the corridors of the base toward her temporary quarters, Sarah's mind was already shifting into operational mode. She had spent 2 decades taking down threats to American interests around the world. The fact that this particular threat was wearing American uniforms and operating on an American base didn't change the fundamental nature of the problem. Some threats had to be eliminated, and Sarah Martinez was very good at eliminating threats. The next morning arrived with the usual chaos of military life. Sarah had spent the night reviewing the duty roster she'd found, cross-referencing the circled names with base personnel records she could access through her security clearance. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Every woman on the list was relatively new to the base, worked in isolated areas, or had shifts that put them in vulnerable positions during off hours. Sarah sat in the base cafeteria, nursing a cup of black coffee and watching the morning crowd filter through. She had positioned herself with a clear view of the entrance, a habit from years of operations where situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. The familiar buzz of conversations, clattering trays, and morning announcements created a backdrop that most people found comforting. To Sarah, it was intelligence gathering. Lieutenant Chen appeared in the food line, moving carefully and keeping her head down. The bruising around her throat was barely visible, hidden by the collar of her uniform, but Sarah could see the way Rebecca favored one side of her neck. The attack had left more than physical marks. Sarah was debating whether to approach Rebecca when the decision was made for her. Harrison, Rodriguez, and Jackson entered the cafeteria together, their voices carrying across the room as they joked loudly about something. Sarah watched as Rebecca's entire body tensed, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a tray. The 3 soldiers hadn't noticed Rebecca yet, but Sarah could see it was only a matter of time. They were scanning the room with the practiced eyes of predators looking for prey. When Harrison's gaze finally landed on Rebecca, his face split into an ugly grin. "Well, look what we have here," Harrison said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "It's our friend from last night. How's the throat feeling, sweetheart?" Rebecca's face went pale, but she continued moving through the food line, trying to pretend she hadn't heard. The soldiers at nearby tables looked up with interest, sensing drama but not understanding the context. Rodriguez nudged Jackson with his elbow. "Maybe she needs another lesson in base etiquette. Some people are slow learners." Sarah stood up from her table, her movements casual but purposeful. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle bullies was to meet their aggression with calm, controlled confidence. As she approached the group, she could see other personnel beginning to take notice of the confrontation. "Gentlemen," Sarah said pleasantly, stepping between the 3 soldiers and Rebecca. "Having a good morning." Harrison's expression darkened when he saw her. His right wrist was wrapped in an elastic bandage, and Sarah noticed he kept flexing his fingers as if testing their mobility. "Oh, it's our mystery woman," Harrison said with mock enthusiasm. "Still playing protector, I see. Tell me, do you make it a habit to stick your nose where it doesn't belong?" Sarah smiled politely. "I make it a habit to ensure everyone can enjoy their breakfast in peace. It's one of those old-fashioned values I picked up during my service." "Your service?" Jackson laughed harshly. "What service? Couple of years pushing papers in some office job?" "Something like that," Sarah replied, her tone remaining conversational. Behind her, she could sense Rebecca moving toward the exit. which was exactly what Sarah wanted. Rodriguez stepped closer to Sarah, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate her. "You know, we've been talking about you, wondering who you think you are, causing trouble for decorated soldiers. Maybe it's time someone taught you about respect." The cafeteria was beginning to quiet down as more people noticed the confrontation. Sarah was aware of the audience but didn't let it distract her from the immediate threat. Years of operations had taught her to track multiple variables simultaneously while maintaining focus on the primary objective. "I have tremendous respect for decorated soldiers," Sarah said calmly. "Perhaps you could tell me about your decorations. I'd love to hear about your service records." Harrison's face flushed red. "You don't get to question our records, lady. We've seen combat, real combat, not whatever desk job you've been hiding behind." "Combat experience is certainly valuable," Sarah acknowledged. "Where did you serve? Iraq? Afghanistan? Syria?" The three soldiers exchanged glances, and Sarah caught the micro-expressions that told her everything she needed to know. Jackson's eyes darted away, Rodriguez's jaw tightened, and Harrison's nostrils flared slightly. These were tells that indicated deception, and Sarah had become an expert at reading them during countless interrogations. "That's classified information," Rodriguez finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Of course, I understand the need for operational security, although most combat veterans I know are pretty eager to share their experiences with fellow service members. It helps with the transition back to garrison life." A new voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned to see Sergeant Major Williams approaching their group. Williams was a career military man in his 50s, with the kind of bearing that commanded immediate respect. His presence changed the dynamics of the confrontation instantly. "No problem, Sergeant Major," Harrison said quickly, his posture snapping to attention. "Just having a friendly conversation with some of the newer personnel." Williams' experienced eyes took in the scene, noting the positions of everyone involved, the tension in the air, and the wrapped bandage on Harrison's wrist. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment, and she saw recognition flicker in his eyes. "Corporal Harrison, isn't it?" Williams said. "I believe you and your team have morning PT scheduled. Wouldn't want you to be late." "Yes, Sergeant Major," Harrison replied stiffly. "We were just heading out." "Excellent. And gentlemen?" Williams waited until all three soldiers were looking at him. "I expect all personnel on this base to conduct themselves according to military standards at all times. Is that understood?" "Yes, Sergeant Major," they replied in unison. As the three soldiers filed out of the cafeteria, Williams turned his attention to Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, isn't it? I believe we have a meeting scheduled this morning to discuss your new assignment." Sarah nodded, recognizing the diplomatic way Williams was extracting her from the situation while establishing her legitimacy in front of the audience. "Yes, Sergeant Major. I was just finishing my breakfast. Why don't you join me in my office when you're ready? I have some paperwork to review with you." After Williams left, Sarah became aware of the conversations resuming around her, though she caught several people glancing in her direction with obvious curiosity. She had managed to diffuse the immediate situation, but she knew Harrison and his friends would interpret this as another humiliation. The pattern was escalating, and escalation meant increased danger for the women on the base. Sarah finished her coffee quickly and made her way to Williams' office. The sergeant major was a known quantity on the base, fair but firm, with a reputation for not tolerating misconduct. If anyone could help her address the situation through proper channels, it would be him. Williams' office was typical for a senior NCO, efficient, organized, and decorated with the accumulated memories of a long career. Photos from various deployments lined the walls, along with commendations and unit citations. Williams gestured for Sarah to take a seat across from his desk. "Close the door, please," Williams said, and Sarah complied before settling into the offered chair. Before we discuss your assignment, Williams began, I think we should address what just happened in the cafeteria and what happened last night in the changing facilities. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Word travels fast. It does when 3 soldiers end up in the medical bay for training injuries that look suspiciously like someone who knows what they're doing administered a comprehensive ass-kicking. Sarah maintained a neutral expression. I'm not sure what you mean, Sergeant Major. Williams chuckled grimly. Ms. Martinez, I've been in the military for 32 years. I know the difference between training injuries and combat-related trauma. Harrison's wrist has hairline fractures consistent with a control hold applied by someone with extensive hand-to-hand training. Rodriguez has bruised ribs from what the medic described as precise impact patterns. And Jackson? Jackson has finger-shaped bruises on his throat that suggest someone very skilled demonstrated how easily a chokehold could be reversed. Sarah remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. Williams leaned back in his chair. Now I could launch an investigation, interview witnesses, review security footage, write reports, but before I do that, I thought I should review your personnel file more carefully. He opened a thick folder on his desk, and Sarah could see that it was much more comprehensive than the standard transfer paperwork. Williams had clearly done his homework. 20 years, Navy SEALs, Williams read aloud. Multiple deployments to classified locations, specialized training in counterterrorism, hostage rescue, and advanced combat techniques. Commendations from 3 different theater commanders. And according to this note from Admiral Patterson, you're being transitioned to training duties because you're too valuable to risk in active operations. Williams closed the file and looked directly at Sarah. So, when 3 troublemakers who've been harassing female personnel for months suddenly end up in medical with injuries that suggest they encountered someone far above their skill level, I have a pretty good idea what happened. Are you planning to file charges, Sergeant Major? Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. Those 3 have been a problem since they arrived here 6 months ago. Complaints from female personnel, reports of inappropriate behavior, incidents that always seem to happen just out of sight of security cameras. We've been building a case, but these things take time, and in the meantime, good soldiers were being driven out of the service. And now? Now I have 3 soldiers who are suddenly very interested in following regulations and staying far away from female personnel. Harrison requested a transfer to a different shift. Rodriguez signed up for additional training courses that will keep him busy for weeks, and Jackson volunteered for extra duty that conveniently keeps him away from the main facilities. Sarah nodded slowly. Sometimes unofficial channels can be more effective than official ones. Indeed, they can, Williams agreed. However, I need to know that any future educational activities will be conducted with appropriate restraint. We can't have personnel ending up in the hospital, regardless of how much they might deserve it. I understand completely, Sergeant Major. Educational activities should always be proportionate to the learning objectives. Williams smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office. I think we understand each other, Miss Martinez. Now, let's discuss your official assignment here. You're going to be working with our training division, helping to develop new combat readiness programs. They spent the next hour reviewing the details of Sarah's new role, but both of them knew that her most important contribution to the base would likely be unofficial. As Sarah prepared to leave, Williams had one final comment. Ms. Martinez? The female personnel on this base have been through enough. They deserve to feel safe while serving their country. I trust that you'll help ensure that safety through whatever channels prove most effective. You can count on it, Sergeant Major. As Sarah left Williams' office, she felt a grim satisfaction. She now had tacit approval from senior leadership to handle threats to base personnel, and the 3 immediate problems had been neutralized. But she also knew that Harrison, Rodriguez, and Jackson were symptoms of a larger issue. There would be others, and some of them might be smarter than the trio she had just dealt with. Sarah spent the rest of the morning touring the training facilities and meeting with the personnel she would be working with. Everyone was professional and welcoming, but she could sense an undercurrent of tension that went beyond the normal stress of military life. The women she met were competent and dedicated, but many of them carried themselves with the hypervigilance of people who had learned not to let their guard down. During lunch, Sarah made a point of sitting with different groups of personnel, listening to conversations and observing interactions. It didn't take long to identify other potential problems. There were certain individuals who seemed to make the women around them uncomfortable, and certain areas of the base that female personnel avoided when possible. As the day progressed, Sarah began to understand that her encounter with Harrison and his friends had been just the tip of the iceberg. The base had a culture problem, and culture problems required more than just eliminating individual threats. They required systematic change, and systematic change required careful planning and precise execution. That evening, Sarah returned to her quarters and began preparing for what she now realized would be a longer and more complex operation than she had initially anticipated. She had come to this base expecting a quiet transition to a training role, but instead found herself facing the kind of mission that had defined her career in the SEALs. The enemy was different this time. They wore the same uniform she did, and they operated within the same chain of command. But the fundamental principles remained the same. Identify the threat, gather intelligence, develop a strategy, and execute with precision and overwhelming force. Sarah pulled out a notebook and began sketching the layout of the base, marking key locations and noting patterns of movement. On a separate page, she started a list of names, both problems and potential allies. This wasn't just about protecting individual women anymore. This was about transforming an entire environment. The mission had begun. 3 weeks later, the transformation of Fort Jackson was becoming apparent to anyone who knew what to look for. Sarah had moved through the base like a force of nature, identifying problems and implementing solutions with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among the SEAL community. The most obvious changes were in the behavior patterns. Female personnel no longer walked in groups out of fear, and the areas that had previously been avoided after dark were now safely accessible. But the deeper changes were in the culture itself, a shift in the way people interacted and the standards they held themselves to. Sarah stood in the observation deck of the main training facility, watching a mixed gender combat exercise unfold below. The participants moved with confidence and mutual respect, working together as integrated teams rather than segregated groups. This was what she had been working toward, not just the elimination of threats, but the creation of an environment where everyone could perform at their best. "Impressive progress," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, approaching with a satisfied expression. Hayes was a career officer who had fought her own battles against institutional bias throughout her rise through the ranks. "The personnel are responding well to the new training protocols," Sarah replied diplomatically. "When people feel secure in their environment, they're able to focus on their professional development." Colonel Hayes moved to stand beside Sarah at the observation window. "I've been reviewing the incident reports from the past 3 weeks. Harassment complaints are down 90%. Disciplinary actions for inappropriate conduct have dropped to almost zero. And somehow, 3 of our most problematic soldiers have either transferred out or shaped up dramatically." Sarah maintained her neutral expression. "Sometimes environmental changes can have unexpected positive effects on behavior." "Indeed," Hayes said with a knowing smile. "I've also received some interesting communications from other base commanders. Apparently, word has spread through certain channels about the cultural improvements at Fort Jackson. Several facilities have requested information about our new approaches to personnel management." "Military personnel talk to each other, Colonel. Good practices tend to spread organically." Hayes nodded slowly. "They also tell stories. Stories about mysterious training accidents that befell troublemakers, about problem soldiers who suddenly became model personnel after brief educational encounters, and about a certain former Navy SEAL who seemed to appear wherever she was needed most. Sarah turned to face the colonel directly. Are you suggesting that there's something irregular about the improvements in base morale and discipline? On the contrary, Hayes replied firmly. I'm suggesting that whatever methods have been employed to achieve these improvements have been remarkably effective and precisely targeted. No excessive force, no violations of military justice protocols, just a series of learning experiences that have helped certain individuals understand the importance of respecting their fellow service members. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the training floor below. A new group was beginning an exercise, and Sarah could see immediately that there was going to be a problem. One of the male participants, Staff Sergeant Miller, was someone she had been watching carefully for the past 2 weeks. Miller had arrived at the base just after Sarah's encounter with Harrison's group, and he had quickly established himself as someone who didn't respect boundaries. He wasn't as crude or overtly aggressive as the original trio, but Sarah's experienced eye had identified the same predatory patterns in more subtle forms. Now, as the mixed-gender team began their exercise, Miller was positioning himself to accidentally make inappropriate contact with the female participants. Sarah could see Private Williams, a young soldier fresh out of basic training, trying to maintain her position in the formation while avoiding Miller's advances. "Excuse me?" "Colonel," Sarah said quietly, "I need to provide some technical guidance on the exercise." Hayes looked down at the training floor and immediately understood what Sarah had seen. "Of course. I'll observe from here to ensure the training maintains proper standards." Sarah made her way down to the training floor with the fluid, purposeful movement that had become her signature around the base. Personnel had learned to recognize that particular walk. It meant someone was about to receive an education in military professionalism. The exercise was a standard team coordination drill, requiring participants to move through an obstacle course while maintaining communication and mutual support. Miller had maneuvered himself into a position where he could help female team members over obstacles by placing his hands in inappropriate locations. Sarah approached the group as Miller was preparing to assist Private Williams over a wall climb. Williams was clearly uncomfortable but didn't want to cause a scene by refusing help from a senior non-commissioned officer. "Staff Sergeant Miller," Sarah called out in a conversational tone that nevertheless carried clearly across the training area. "Could I speak with you for a moment about the proper spotting technique for this obstacle?" Miller turned, his expression showing mild annoyance at the interruption. He had heard stories about the mysterious woman who had somehow tamed Harrison's group, but Miller considered himself more sophisticated than those crude amateurs. "I've got plenty of experience with spotting techniques," Miller replied with a condescending smile. "But thanks for the offer." Sarah moved closer, her demeanor remaining friendly and professional. "I'm sure you do. However, I've noticed some safety concerns with your current approach that we should address before someone gets injured." "Safety concerns?" Miller laughed, loud enough for the other participants to hear. "Lady, I've been doing this since before you probably even enlisted. I think I can handle helping some rookie over a wall." The other team members had stopped their exercise to watch the interaction, sensing tension but not quite understanding the context. Private Williams remained frozen at the base of the wall, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but unsure how to extract herself from the situation. Sarah's expression remained pleasant, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Staff Sergeant, I think there may be a misunderstanding about my background and experience level. Perhaps we should discuss this privately?" Miller's chest puffed out as he attempted to assert his authority. "There's nothing to discuss privately. This is a training exercise, and I'm conducting it according to established procedures. If you have concerns about my methods, you can file a report through proper channels." "That's certainly an option," Sarah agreed calmly. "Or we could address the safety issues right now through a practical demonstration. Would you prefer the formal report or the hands-on training?" There was something in Sarah's tone that made several of the more experienced soldiers in the group take a step back. They might not know her specific background, but they recognized the voice of someone who had seen real combat. Miller, however, was too focused on his wounded ego to pick up on the warning signs. "Fine. Show me these safety issues you're so worried about, but make it quick. We have a schedule to keep." Sarah nodded appreciatively. "Excellent. The primary safety concern is improper hand placement during spotting. When helping someone over an obstacle, it's crucial to provide support without compromising their balance or dignity." She moved to demonstrate with Private Williams, who looked relieved to have Sarah's intervention. The correct spotting position provides stability and leverage while maintaining appropriate professional contact. Sarah's demonstration was flawless, supportive, effective, and completely respectful. Private Williams easily cleared the obstacle with Sarah's help, landing gracefully and safely on the other side. "Now," Sarah continued, turning back to Miller, "the incorrect technique involves hand placement that could be interpreted as inappropriate or could compromise the climber's balance." Miller rolled his eyes. "Look, lady, I've never had anyone complain about my spotting technique. You're making a big deal out of nothing." "I hope you're right," Sarah said sincerely. "But since safety is paramount in training exercises, I think we should test your technique to make sure there are no misunderstandings. Why don't you demonstrate your spotting approach, and I'll provide feedback?" Miller looked around at the watching soldiers and realized he had painted himself into a corner. Refusing the demonstration would look like backing down from a civilian, but going through with it might expose flaws in his approach that he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Fine," Miller said with exaggerated patience. "But let's get this over with quickly." Sarah positioned herself at the base of the wall climb, preparing to go over the obstacle. "Whenever you're ready, Staff Sergeant, please use your standard spotting technique." Miller moved into position behind Sarah, and immediately she could feel his intentions. His hand placement was designed to make contact with areas that had nothing to do with providing legitimate support. As he reached toward her, Sarah made her move. The technique was so smooth and fast that most of the observers missed exactly what happened. One moment Miller was reaching to spot Sarah, and the next moment he was face down on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that made any movement impossible. This is an example of what can happen when improper hand placement compromises both the spotter's and the climber's position, Sarah explained calmly to the watching soldiers, maintaining her hold on Miller with apparent ease. "As you can see, when the spotter's focus is on inappropriate contact rather than proper support, everyone's safety is compromised." Miller tried to struggle against the hold, but quickly realized that moving only increased the pressure on his joints. "Let me go," he gasped. "This is assault." "This is education," Sarah corrected gently. "You'll notice that I'm able to maintain complete control of the situation using minimal force. This is because proper technique is always more effective than raw aggression." She maintained the hold for another few seconds, ensuring that Miller and everyone watching understood the demonstration, then released him with a fluid motion that left him free but slightly disoriented. Miller scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "You can't do that. I'm going to report this to my commanding officer." Sarah nodded approvingly. "That's an excellent idea, Staff Sergeant. Proper channels are always the best way to address concerns about training procedures. I'm sure your commanding officer will be very interested in reviewing the safety protocols for mixed-gender exercises." The implication was clear to everyone present. If Miller filed a complaint, he would have to explain exactly what he had been doing when Sarah intervened. Any investigation would quickly reveal the pattern of inappropriate behavior that Sarah had interrupted. Miller looked around at the faces of the other soldiers, seeing everything from amusement to disgust in their expressions. He was smart enough to realize that he had been outmaneuvered completely. "Forget it," he muttered. "Let's just finish the exercise." "Actually," Sarah said pleasantly, "I think this would be a good time for everyone to take a break and review the safety protocols for spotting techniques. Why don't we reconvene in 15 minutes after everyone has had a chance to study the manual?" The group began to disperse, with several soldiers approaching Sarah to ask questions about proper techniques. Private Williams lingered near Sarah, clearly wanting to express her gratitude, but unsure how to do it without drawing more attention to what had happened. "Private Williams," Sarah said quietly, "could you help me review the equipment checklist for the next exercise? I want to make sure everything is properly maintained." Williams nodded gratefully, understanding that Sarah was giving her a legitimate reason to stay close while the situation settled. As they walked toward the equipment storage area, Williams finally found her voice. "Thank you," she said simply. "I wasn't sure what to do about him." "You don't have to do anything," Sarah replied. "It's the responsibility of leadership to ensure that all personnel can train in a safe professional environment. When that doesn't happen automatically, sometimes it requires direct intervention." "Are you going to get in trouble for what you did to him?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Staff Sergeant Miller is going to be very careful about his behavior for the foreseeable future. He knows that any complaint he files will result in scrutiny of his own conduct, and I don't think he wants that kind of attention." As they reached the equipment area, Sarah noticed Colonel Hayes approaching. The base commander had observed the entire incident from the observation deck and was now coming to personally review what had happened. "Ms. Martinez," Hayes called out as she approached. "That was an interesting demonstration of spotting techniques. Very educational." "Thank you, Colonel. I thought it was important to address the safety concerns before someone was injured." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Indeed. I think everyone involved learned something valuable today. Staff Sergeant Miller in particular seemed to gain new insight into proper training procedures." "Education is always more effective when it's interactive," Sarah observed. "I couldn't agree more," Hayes replied. "In fact, I've been thinking that we should formalize these teaching methods. Would you be interested in developing a comprehensive program on professional conduct and safety protocols for mixed-gender training environments?" Sarah considered the offer. A formal program would give her the authority to address problems proactively rather than waiting for incidents to occur. It would also send a clear message throughout the base about the standards that were expected. "I think that could be very beneficial for the entire command," Sarah said. "When would you like me to begin developing the curriculum?" "Immediately," Hayes replied. "I want this program implemented across all training divisions within 30 days. And Ms. Martinez, I want you to have full authority to modify training procedures and personnel assignments as needed to ensure the program's success." Sarah understood exactly what the colonel was offering. Carte blanche to reshape the base's culture from the ground up, with official backing and unlimited authority. It was more power than she had ever expected to wield in a non-combat assignment. "I won't let you down, Colonel." "I know you won't," Hayes replied, "because failure isn't an option. Too many good soldiers have been driven out of the service by the kind of behavior we've been discussing. It stops here. And it stops now." As Colonel Hayes walked away, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that came with completing a successful mission. But this wasn't really the end. It was the beginning of something much larger. Word would spread to other bases about the transformation at Fort Jackson, and eventually, the methods developed here would be implemented throughout the military. 6 months later, Sarah would receive a call from the Pentagon asking her to lead a military-wide initiative on professional conduct and training safety. The program she developed at Fort Jackson would become the template for cultural change across all branches of the armed forces. But for now, Sarah was content to watch Private Williams confidently leading her team through the obstacle course, moving with the assurance of someone who knew she was safe and respected in her work environment. Staff Sergeant Miller had requested a transfer to a different base within a week of their encounter, and the 3 soldiers from Sarah's first night had either shaped up completely or found themselves assigned to remote locations where their supervision could be more closely monitored. The changing room where it all began was now a place where personnel could prepare for their duties without fear or harassment. The culture of intimidation had been replaced by one of mutual respect and professional excellence. Sarah Martinez had accomplished something that no amount of official training or policy changes had been able to achieve. She had proven that sometimes the most effective way to create lasting change was through the direct, personal intervention of someone who refused to accept that the way things are was the way things had to be. As she watched the successful completion of the day's training exercises, Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. 20 years as a Navy SEAL had taught her many lessons, but perhaps the most important was that protecting others was not just a job, it was a calling that followed you wherever you went. The mission was complete, but the work would continue.